Okay, yes.
Okay, so it's a great pleasure to have Thibaut, our colleague. We all know him, and I'm really looking forward to this lecture on statistical physics of ecosystems, and it's a lot for.
Thank you, Sir Francesco. Welcome all of you to this series of lectures entitled Statistical Physics of Ecosystems, during which I will address questions that lie at the intersection of statistical physics, which I obviously don't need to define here, and community ecology. So community ecology, broadly defined, is the study of populations that coexist in a given environment. And the first remark that I would like to make, and that's kind of obvious from this definition, is that the scope of community ecology is extremely vast. I mean, you can have systems ranging from tropical trees in the Amazons, plankton in the lake, fish in the same lake, microbes in the human gut, and so on. And in fact, most of the research in community ecology is made of very precise case studies tied to very specific systems. And it turns out that most of the conclusions from all these studies are extremely contingent on the organisms involved and the environment they live in. And thus, these conclusions, they resist many attempts at generalization, let's say. And what really unifies the field, therefore, is more the kind of data that are being collected and treated, meaning tables of abundances of taxa across samples, and these samples can be different times, they could be different locations, and also the kinds of questions that are being asked, and that's often with an eye towards management, forecast, conservation. And in that sense, this makes the bulk of community ecology quite far from statistical physics. Closer to the spirit of statistical physics is the subfield called macroecology, which aims at identifying and explaining statistical regularities in the structure of these ecological communities. And some of these regularities will be at the core of this lecture. And now I'd like to go back to this definition of community ecology, or an ecological communities, as a set of population that coexist in a given environment. And this definition, on top of being very vast, as I said before, is manifestly a bit loose, because it does not describe the spatial scale of the environment under scrutiny. It does not prescribe the scale, the temporal scale of coexistence. And it does not either constrain the taxonomic boundaries of what you call the community. But in fact, the local coexistence of a variety of taxonomically very different species is something that is quite generic. For instance, if you take any forest, and if you look at animals there, you will find predators, herbivores, pollinators, and you will also find plants and decomposers such as fungi or bacteria. And all of these different trophic levels can be populated by individuals belonging to very different species themselves. And so, in order to set a bit the scope of the course, in order to set a bit the scope of the course, I would like to impose some restrictions on the scale and boundaries that I will consider here. So first, I will focus on species-rich, many species, what's called horizontal communities, meaning communities made of taxa, and that over, I don't know, something like 20 orders of magnitude. So this is typically not the kind of questions that I will address in this lecture.
Everyone understands, because what I remember, if you take terrestrial animals, ants constitute, like humongous, totally not new. So why in the sea?
So there is no clear theoretical explanation as to why it's so uniform. There is definitely one factor that contributes to uniformity, is that the rule in aquatic ecosystems is big and small, and that's what defines the food chain. Whereas the flux of energy are much less directed in terrestrial ecosystem. But why this constant? It's not so IPhT-TV. Homogeneous, or a bit more precisely over scales over which this environment can be considered as statistically translational invariant in case there are local fluctuations in these different variables. Invariant in case there are local fluctuations in these different variables. So for instance, another pattern that has attracted a lot of attention in the field that won't be discussed in this lecture is what's called the longitudinal over which the environment can. So having said these restrictions and having told you what I'm not going to talk about, I'd like to tell you more what I'm going to talk about now. And what I have chosen for this lecture is to use the ecological notion of rarity as a unifying theme. And my goal will be to connect this notion of rarity to more statistical physics concepts such as fluctuations and scales. So in fact, rarity is extremely common in high diversity ecosystems, common if not ubiquitous, meaning that the vast bulk of the biodiversity that we observe is made of species that are actually very rare. So one way to see that is the notion of dominance, and data from a wide range of natural communities show that generically it's just a few percent of the species that you find in a given sample that are going to account for most of the biomass. So here they've taken just a meta-analysis with data from bacteria, fish, fungi, herbs, whatever you want, counting the number of species and evaluating the fraction of those species accounting for more than half of the biomass. And for species-rich ecosystem, you see it's just typically a few percent. And for instance, in the Amazon forest, where this has been done, and where, to give you a few orders of magnitude, it's 15,000 species of trees that have been identified with a certain constraint of the size, so big trees. It's 2% of the species that account for 50% of the Amazon biomass. And obviously, these are conservative estimates because when you sample, the species that you are the most likely to not sample are the ones that are the more rare.
Is the number of species that account for, let's say, most of the biomass the same in species-rich or poor systems? When you said the fraction, of course, was smaller in species-rich systems, which sounds logical because there are more species, but the absolute number, is it the same?
I mean, I don't know if that's... I'm not sure it's that logical, because you could say that if two species roughly, I mean, if you observe an ecosystem with, I don't know, 1,000 bacteria, you could imagine that they are going to, or types of bacteria, like, you could imagine that they're going to be evenly distributed with roughly all the same abundances. And that's not at all what happens. I don't think we can say anything such as the number being the same, though. I don't think that's something that's being conserved.
In one book, I remember, I forgot the name, very famous scientist who studied ants. He said that you just dig here 1 meter, and that would be, most of the species there are unknown still. Right.
So to be a bit more quantitative, zooming in into these highly diverse communities, you can look at what's called the species abundance distribution, which is essentially an histogram that tells you what is the fraction of species that have a given abundance, meaning a given number of individuals in a sample, or I mean that could be absolute abundance, or that can be relative count, so fraction of the total number of species. And this distribution, when you sample them in very different communities, they tend to be broadly distributed. So here, and often within a significant range of the distribution, they can be reasonably well fitted by Fowler distributions. So here, that's an example from sampling of the human gut microbiome. So, I mean, the abundance of the different types of bacteria, I'll say a bit more about what we call species for bacteria, because this notion is a bit blurry. but the number of types of bacteria, the relative abundance spans roughly 5 orders of magnitude. And over those 5 orders of magnitude, the cumulative distribution function is reasonably well described by the power law. Here, the exponent gamma tends to be non-universal across communities. Here, it's roughly 0.7, but it's not a universal number. I have a few more examples of this. So these are species abundance distribution for other communities, marine plankton, and trees in the Amazon. So they are plotted differently. That's more the way you see them in ecological literature, meaning you indicate on the x-axis the rank of the species, the most abundant, the second most abundant, etc., and its abundance on the y-axis. But it's just a rewriting of the same data, essentially. And these distributions, they are also well fitted. So you see there is this whole scale of 4 orders of magnitude. Here, same thing, roughly 3 orders of magnitude in terms of abundances. And these distributions are well fitted by power law in the sector of rare species. And then there is some kind of exponential truncation at large population sizes. And in that case, the exponent was shown to be roughly 0.5. And these are local samples, so many different local samples from the ocean. This is more the global scale in the Amazon. I mean, it's a compilation of many local subsamples. And here the exponent was shown to be very small. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that it was also quite common, even though it's a bit more contingent on the system, but that depends a lot on the time scale for population dynamics, because you need to be able to observe long time series. But there is commonly turnover in the identity of who is abundant and who is not. So that's not something that is being fixed in time, typically. And that's obviously much more visible, or much more easily visible in systems with short generation times, because then you can follow the population for many generations. So this is an example from marine plankton. So same as before. So it's Eulerian sampling. So each day you go at the same place and you sample locally the biodiversity that you see there. They have identified 50,000 different types of plankton. And you see there are wide fluctuations in who is dominating the ecosystem. But at each instant of time, just a handful of species account for most of the biomass. This this draws a similar qualitative picture, although it's in space. So this is a sampling in some part of the Amazon of the bacterial community that you find on the leaves of bromeliads. So it's a kind of a small tree. And the color code is one type of bacteria. And so each horizontal line is the repartition of these different type of bacteria, which are essentially living in the same environment for the different leaves, so different samples. So you could see that as variability in space now, showing huge variability in the identity of who is the most abundant. One precision that I wanted to make, here you might see the letters OTU, that means operational taxonomic units, because as I was mentioning, we don't have a clear definition of what's a species for plankton or bacteria that don't reproduce sexually. So what's being used as a proxy for a species is this operational taxonomic unit. It's essentially a clustering of the different bacteria that you see based on genetic proximity with some standardized procedure. Okay, and now I'll switch to the board. So just switch that off.
I switch it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So about the exponent that you said it's non-universal, do you know, I mean, is there a way to, I mean, do you know if there is some understanding qualitatively on the dependence of the exponent from the type of system, some like getting things? I mean, can we get some universal understanding of universal stuff?
So yeah, that's a bit part of the question that I'll try to answer. I'd say that we don't have a definitive understanding because there is no consensus on the mechanisms that lead to these broad distributions. That would be my answer.
So you talk about the interaction between the various species and the environment and what defines the ecological system.
So, sorry?
What defines the ecological system? Because it's a system in interaction.
Yes.
Interacting with the substrate, whatever. And so how do you define a community or something like that?
So I mean, that's what I was saying. I mean, it's a bit a loose definition, but typically that's it. That's a set of species. I'll use the word species, even though it's inappropriate in certain contexts, that coexists at the same time in the same location with those restrictions that I put on what I mean by same time and same locations, and that are potentially interacting together.
And with
and with their environment. Yes. Okay, so now I'll turn to, I mean, most of the course will be dedicated to the modeling of of ecological dynamics and how what we learn from model can be connected to what we kind of ubiquitously see in the data. And I wanted to start by quite a simple discussion on what I would call focal species model.
Is the aim of your theory to basically reproduce the results you just showed, or I mean, what's the main aim? Which type of results do you want to?
So we want, so yes, so I say that the goal of this theory is to explain how you can maintain a very large diversity of species that are relatively similar. Like in all what I showed, those are species that are roughly doing the same thing if you think in terms of broad ecological function. Why this large distribution arise? I mean, this broad distribution of population sizes arise. And yes, I mean, I would say that those are, and also the notion of fluctuations turnover, that this is something generic. And see how this can generically emerge from models of population dynamics and understand the conditions in which we can explain the emergence of these features. Okay, so that will set the stage for a later discussion. So let's imagine that you have, I don't know, so 1 meter by 1 meter square somewhere, and you're tracking over time the abundance of a given population. So that's why we call the species the focal species. So I don't know, you have n, this is of size L, volume or area, depends if you're in 3D or 2D, I would call that omega. And so you have n of t individuals. Obviously, this is typically not an isolated system. If you make 1 meter by 1 meter squared in the forest, it will be connected to the rest of the forest. So you might have also some influx or outflux of individual inside and outside of the system. And what I would like to write is the kind of generic equation that one would like to write to describe the evolution of this quantity. And I will make a few assumptions. So first, that NT is very large compared to 1. And I will make a continuous approximation of the dynamics. So I will treat this n of t as a continuous variable. And I will also assume that the system is well mixed, meaning that during the generation time, individuals move over scales, we call it L, which are much larger. So just as an example of this, that will allow me to give a few more orders of magnitude. So if you look at the E. coli bacteria in experimental condition, experimental conditions, and here I'm taking the number from Ushmanzadeh PRL 208. So we'll find that these bacteria, they essentially move diffusively.
They can go out and in.
So in this setting, yes, you can imagine that they can go out and in of the volume. Here, no, but it's a very large volume. So the diffusion coefficient, that's the diffusion coefficient is roughly 10 to the 2 micrometer square per minute. And the generation time is roughly 10 to the 3 minutes. So you get the scale L that is of the order of 10 to the 2 micrometer. So, so 10 to the 3 minutes, a bit more. It's roughly, I mean, what they got was something like 15 hours. That's typical for bacteria. Depending on the richness of the media, you can have some variation. Can range from around 1 hour to around 20 hours. That's the typical time scale for bacterial reproduction.
It's a reproduction, it's not that they live 15 hours.
No, it's doubling time.
It's so that they live only 15
But I mean, those are very dependent on the richness of the media also.
Does it matter that if it's in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions or even some other spatial structure?
Yes, so these are things that we'll investigate towards the end. So for now, I'm being quite agnostic. I mean, this at the beginning of the lecture, I will be in this well-mixed setting. So assuming that locally I'm looking at something that has no spatial fluctuations. So for now, there's no, this is not important, but it will become important. So classically, the kind of model that people write take this very simple form. And it's a sum of 3 terms. So the first term is proportional to the population times some function g, which might depend on the population size and on time. So the dependence on time can account for, I mean, the explicit dependence on time can account for, I don't know, fluctuations in the environment, daily variations in temperature, for instance. It could also account for the fact that here, I mean, I'm following the trajectories of a single species, but obviously it's interacting with many more species around, and I'm not explicitly tracking their dynamics, but because they are interacting, this function g, which is the per capita growth rate, can change because the populations of the species with which the species we are following is changing. So this is the per capita growth rate.
But in the case,
Yes.
in the case you say it wouldn't be local in time if it interacts with other particles and we get one of them. There would be a memory kernel.
Definitely, definitely. So here I'm being quite vague. I'm being quite vague, and for this, I mean, the beginning of this lecture, I'll present things in the simplest, I would say, setting. Then I will go on taking explicitly into account interactions, and that will lead to non-locality in time. So this is the influx or outflux. I mean, it can be both positive and negative. And this is what is called, so eta is the Gaussian-wide noise. And this is what is called demographic noise. And it's understood in the info discretization. So the origin of the demographic noise is the following. So if you look at some time interval, let's say delta t, the number of birth-death events that you have will scale with n times delta t. And the change in population size will be the resulting change for all of these birth-death events, the sum of the results of all these birth-death events. So obviously, if you're saying that during this window delta t, the birth-death events are independent between the different individuals that you have in your population, then that means that the variance in time delta t will also scale as n delta t. And if you have many events, if the population is large, you expect fluctuations to be Gaussian. So essentially that gives rise to a Gaussian term that scales as the square root of n. So yes. Sorry. So big T is just essentially, if you think as G as the birth rate minus the death rate, big T, which is the amplitude of this noise, you can think of it as the birth rate plus the death rate. But it's just a parameter in this setting that quantifies the amount of fluctuations. I'm calling it T just by analogy with statistical mechanics. It has nothing to do with a temperature in the thermodynamic sense. So the last assumption that I wanted to make is that G and T is a function of the concentration, because as I was saying, you expect n to be large. I mean, you expect to work in a regime where n is assumed to be large. So this term that is scaling as n is much larger than this one, typically. So in order to make that explicit, I will assume that G is a function of the concentration that I will call small n. which is n divided by omega, which we take as being some finite number, order 1 number. And in which case we get the following equation. With lambda prime is equal to lambda divided by omega, and t prime is equal to t divided by omega. Essentially, that number being very small. So we're working in a small noise.
So what's the status of these equations? Are they standard, or did you just use them for pedagogical reasons in this course?
No. These are the basic classic equation in the field. When you want to look at what can happen in one population, essentially they encompass the fact that things can move, things can reproduce and die, and that reproduction and death is a multiplicative process, and that it's also noisy. And if you have a lot of individuals, then you expect noise intensity to be rather small.
Okay, so how old are these equations, and do they have a name?
So this is called the stochastic logistic group equation. Or rather, let me specify what I'm going to say here before giving them a name. Okay. One, yes.
So the lambda prime, you always assume that it's positive, because if it's negative, you can go to negative value, which is bad.
Yeah, okay. So typically what you would expect is that so this is the lambda prime of t. You have the influx. The outflux we like to write as proportional to n. So the negative part, when n is small, goes to 0, so you will only get the negative part. So there is a mechanism that prevents population from obviously becoming negative. Okay, so one last thing that I wanted to state is that this is an effective model at the level of the entire population, and that's something that will be constant throughout this course, is that here I'm not taking into account the internal structure of the population. I'm treating all the individuals in the population as being equivalent. So there is no sexual differences, there is no age structure in that population, or rather it has all been summed up effectively in that language. So generically, even though sometimes it's used in a bit more specific setting, this type of equation is known as the stochastic logistic group equation. So the first thing that comes up in this equation, which is a really distinctive feature of any problem in population dynamics, is that in isolated systems, here meaning lambda is equal to 0, the noise of the birth death process will inevitably lead the population to go extinct. So n equal to 0 is an absorbing state. If I set lambda to 0 and n to 0, doesn't move, right? So extinction is an absorbing state. If you have no individual from your species, it's not going to appear from nowhere. So the stochasticity of birth-death processes leads to extinction. And now, how the thing goes extinct depends a bit on how you parameterize the model.
Sorry, no matter of G, yeah, of course.
Yes, yeah. So the first assumption that you can make, which is a very strong assumption, and in fact we know from experiments that typically when you observe time series of ecological population, you need to take into account this ingredient, but you can assume that let's say case 1, that the environment has no explicit time dependence. That's a very crude setting, meaning that G does not depend on time. Yes?
G as 0 a positive value of n, and I'm on one side of this 0. I mean, in principle, there is no way to jump the barrier with the noise. I mean, is it really generic that when you have noise, I mean, you need to have some smoothness of G that, I mean, if you imagine that you have some dynamics that by construction of G is confined to beyond some region, I mean, there is no.
You would mean, like, for instance, if G gives us 1 over n?
No, think
Or-
about at 0. Okay, no, I need to think about it, but I mean,
Typically logistic with human vision
Yeah.
is like G equal 1 minus n.
So I'll
N 1 minus n. And so
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
hardly grow, beyond this y, and then noise, as he said, eventually kills you.
So you're right that I should have been a bit more careful. There is one setting in which you can evade this extinction if G is constant and positive. If G is constant and positive, you have a finite probability to just explode. So here, effectively, since you're in a finite environment, I'm assuming that, okay, the population cannot go arbitrarily large. So there is some mechanism, I'll explain that here, that prevents the population from exploding. And I'll take the simple case where G of n is positive for some n less than n naught, and G of n is negative for some n larger than n naught, with n naught larger than 0. So that the deterministic dynamics converge to n naught. So, for instance, and that's the simplest thing that you can write, because all of this is very phenomenological, right? So the simplest thing that you can write would be G of n is equal to R, would be linear in n. With n naught is equal here to R divided by epsilon. So this is known as the This is really known what's the logistic growth, this linear term. And so this term encodes the fact that, okay, at small populations, you have exponential growth of the population sizes. But then when the population starts to grow, there is an effective, you can think as an effective competition between the different individuals of the population for the pool of resources that's available in the medium in which they are growing. So you can't have infinitely many individuals. There needs to be some terms that decreases the growth rate. Simply you take the linear. I mean, when you fit the growth of ecological populations to this kind of equations with this form, okay, you get qualitatively the right regime most of the time. Okay.
Lifetime before extinction.
Yes, that's what I mean. So in this case, I mean, that's fairly standard, that the lifetime before extinction, it's essentially a barrier crossing problem. So it will follow something that is very similar to Arrhenius law. So the mean time to extinction behaves as in that case, essentially it's exponential in what I was calling the volume of the system or the typical number of individuals that you have in the system. Now, if you want to be yes, you're right. I was writing right. Thanks.
For any G or for the specific G?
No, that's for the generic form for energy. Now, something that we did not take into account so far is that the environment, and here I understand it broadly as contributions from, like, I don't know, concentration of nutrients, temperature, all this, but also the behavior of the other species with which the species that we're considering is interacting and that we did not take into account in this model. So this can fluctuate in time. And so in the simple setting where the time scale of fluctuation is much shorter than the generation time, and where you assume that there is no feedback from the population. So the fact that the population varies does not change the environment in which it's living. At least does not change the situations of the environment in which it's living. So it's kind of a strong assumption. But if you think about temperature fluctuations, that's not so absurd, right? Then what you might be led to write is the following equation. And I'm going to stick to this logistic form for now. which is dn dt, is equal to n r plus sigma psi of t minus epsilon n plus square root 2t and eta of t, where once more we're taking psi of t as a Gaussian white noise. And this noise, which enters as a perturbation in time of the growth rate, is called environmental noise. And the big difference with respect to this one is that this one reflects processes that are stochastic, but that are independent between the different individuals. Like, okay, do I die in this time window is relatively independent from the question of do someone else die in this time window. This environmental noise, whose amplitude is proportional to n, acts collectively at the level of the whole population. So it's the whole population level. So if temperature suddenly drops, then collectively that would, for instance, diminish the growth rate of the entire population.
The reaction time is what? R?
Yes.
R is fluctuating now.
So R is fluctuating now. The growth rate is fluctuating.
And the fact that it can become negative is never a problem?
I mean, if R becomes
bounded noise, psi, or?
if R is I mean, what? No. Here I'll take Gaussian white noise. If R becomes negative, it's not a problem. It just means that for some time, the environment is detrimental to you.
But mathematically, really, so in the generation time R or 1 over R, what does it mean? Time scale of fluctuation is much smaller, just in terms of the sigma R.
So I mean, if you were to take psi as a correlated noise, let's say.
Time scale of fluctuation is much less than generation.
Yeah.
So what is in terms of this parameter R and sigma? What does it mean?
So here, essentially, I mean, the time scale of the population dynamics would be 1 over R, right? And here, the time scale of fluctuations, I've killed it because I made the approximation that this one is Gaussian and white. So under the fact that the correlation time, under the assumption that the correlation time of this noise is much smaller than 1 over R, I essentially represent it as a Gaussian white noise.
Another thing I didn't understand, you said it is back to the population level.
Yes.
Theta is multiplied by square root of n also. So
Yes, but here it's square root.
yeah.
And so I agree it's proportional, but not to entire n. And this has a different origin, that these represent processes that are stochastic but independent across individuals. And these represent processes that are stochastic but correlated across the entire population. Hence the scaling of the variance, which is different.
So it should dominate, no?
So at small,
It's not too small.
yeah. So here we're working in this regime where this amplitude is very small, the noise amplitude is very small. So indeed it dominates, and it changes completely the scaling to extinction. The one thing that I wanted to mention is that here I will use Stratonovich interpretation for this one, in line with the fact that I was assuming that there is a noise whose time scale has been sent to 0 and replaced by a Gaussian white noise. But it's a very innocuous assumption because you can change the discretization of the noise just by shifting R. I mean, mathematically, it's equivalent to shifting R. So now what does this noise does? It's what we were discussing with Kiran, the fact that the conditions can become detrimental sometimes for the population, even though not on average. And that makes the population much more prone in this very restricted setting of a well-mixed system, etc. That makes the population much more prone to extinctions. Essentially, the mechanism is that large positive fluctuations of this guy won't matter so much because they will be compensated by the saturating term, whereas large negative fluctuations are just dropping you down exponentially. And this changes quite radically the scaling of the extinction time now as a power law dependence of the. So if you're interested, meaning that this is the typical number of individuals, now it's a power law in the typical number of individuals, if provided that R is positive, meaning that on average, the population is maintained. And that, I mean, where this is coming from, we'll discuss it next. Okay, I'll just finish with that section for 5 minutes. Now let's imagine that you're taking into account the fact that the system that you're considering is embedded in a much larger system. And let's do that by the most naive way possible. By assuming that the influx of individuals into the system is constant. So that is quite unlikely to represent what is happening if you draw a plot outside and look at what happened. But in experiment, that's something that can be implemented, and that is routinely implemented into ecological experiments. Yes?
I like this your power law formula, but if I just somehow take capital T being equal to 0, and there is only environmental noise, so what should I expect? How I should interpret?
So if there is only environmental noise,
Yeah.
I mean in this modeling, the population never goes extinct if R is positive. Because you see, let's forget the fact that it's noise. Make this just a function of time, right? Drop this term.
Yeah.
Let's assume that the population is rare. Drop this one also. So it's just exponential growth with a time varying growth rate. And that never.
I lost it where you drop epsilon. It's epsilon equal to 0.
Where? In this result?
Yeah.
No. Epsilon just it doesn't. The exponent here does not know about epsilon.
Perfectly fine. So without this environmental noise and without another noise, of course, it would go to n equal r divided by epsilon.
Yes.
Stay there forever.
Yeah. Forever.
Yeah, but
Now let's imagine that you have this.
This node, but you still have it.
Yes. So effectively, what's happening when the population is rare, and when it's close to extinction, right, is that it's doing exponential growth or decay with with time varying growth rate. It's essentially doing a random walk in log time, in log abundances. So there is no mechanism that would set n to 0 in finite time.
But your formula,
we want
if I put
infinity.
t equal to 0, your formula, so I didn't get it.
Ah, yes, sorry. Yeah. Okay. My bad. Sorry. It's a minus. Yeah, it's in terms of the number of individuals. Yes. Sorry. So this if you take now this dynamics, and I'll conclude here. With lambda fixed and positive, now you kill the presence of the absorbing state. Equal 0 is not an absorbing state anymore, because you have individuals coming from the outside. And effectively, in the long time, you reach you reach a stationary state, just one-dimensional Langevin equation. You can compute, it's an easy exercise to compute the distribution. I'll just write it explicitly. When t is equal to 0, that's where the formula is more illuminating. So the physical meaning of setting t equal to 0 in the presence of migration is essentially saying that in your system, when you couple to migration, the migration is such that you always have a large number of individuals. You never go to 1, 2, 3 individuals in the system that you're considering. Then you get the gamma distribution in the steady state for the population, which up to a normalization factor reads, no, it's not. It's not gamma with lambda. The population is distributed with so this is the distribution of the population size. So here, that prevents the population from approaching 0 because of the migration. This prevents the population from exploding because of this confinement term. And so
Exactly.
because there is a normalization, constant. No. So now, in the presence so if the migration is small, such that there is a real separation between the confinement, the value at which confinement is imposed from above, and confinement is imposed from below, you get the following distribution. It's smooth. So in log, where here this is order lambda, and here there is an intermediate power law regime, which tells us with slope -1 plus 2r sigma squared. The conclusion from this is that the presence of the absorbing state at n equals 0 when lambda is equal to 0 generically leads to the emergence of broad steady-state distributions with power law regime in some intermediate range that can be basically as broad as we want based on the value of lambda. And the mechanism here is essentially that when n gets close to 0, because the dynamics is everywhere proportional to n up to the small lambda term, the dynamics is very slow once you're small. So you're going to stick there, even though there is no real mechanism attracting you to 0. And so the distribution will concentrate close to n equals 0, provided that the noise is large enough to compensate for deterministic effects, so provided that this is less than 1. And okay, and that will conclude this discussion on the single species kind of model that are classically used in the field. And I think we're taking a break.
Okay. Maybe there are questions.
Yes, maybe there are questions before.
No questions. No break.
Okay. deuxième énergie physics. So now I want to discuss something entirely different. So I was talking about simple models for one population in the presence of noise, no spatial heterogeneity, very simple. Now I want to discuss another ingredient that will be common in the course, which is the presence of interactions between the different populations that are coexisting in the environment in which they live in. And I'll start by discussing these models at the deterministic level. So now what we're considering is an ensemble of S interacting species and I'll write the population sizes as Ni of t for I is equal to 1. And here I will neglect quite a few of the ingredients that I introduced just before. So no demographic noise. No migration. And no environmental noise. In the sense that noise from outside of the system. So now what I want to write, following what I've written before, sort of as a general equation, is this. So I have Ni times some per capita growth rate of species I, which I express as a function of all the other population sizes. And now the minimal model so before I introduce the logistic term, which is just constant, which is linear in n. So the minimal model is just going to be the extension of this. So it's the, sometimes called generalized Lotka-Volterra model. So in which the per capita growth rate is a linear instantaneous functions of population size. So I will write it as dni dt equal to ni times ri minus sum over j alpha j with alpha being called the interaction matrix. So what alpha ij says, from this equation, is that alpha ij tells you how population j, the presence of j, increases or decreases the growth rate of population I. So if alpha ij and alpha ji are positive, we typically speak about competition. So I is negative for j is negative for I. So it's what happens if you're competing for a common pool of resources. If alpha ij is positive, but alpha ji is negative, that would be predation. J benefits from the presence of I, but the presence of J is detrimental for I. And the last case in which both coefficients are positive is mutualism, where both species benefit from the presence of each other.
And sometimes you know that all this N function is touch, there's no time delay.
Exactly. And so I'll just mention briefly what extinctions of these that could be ecologically relevant. And when you're doing statistical physics approach, what you gain from adding those extra ingredients is another question. But remark, so possible additions would be time delays. So that typically happens when you have what are called MacArthur model, where what you're modeling is population and resources, and the interaction between the population is mediated through the amount of resources that is available in the medium. So effectively, because there is something that mediates the interaction between populations, that would correspond to some kind of time delay. You can have nonlinearities, like saturating effects, that or you can imagine to have a K body that's also known to happen in ecological communities, K body interactions with K larger than 2. You could have many more ingredients to the model. So this is really the simplest minimal model that you can think of. Okay. Now, I'd like to discuss what happens if the dynamics, which I've written here, converges to a fixed point. And I'll be mostly giving some definitions and concepts that I'll be using afterwards. So let's imagine that the dynamics converges to a fixed point where all species are present. So here, all species coexist. Then it's for the fixed point n is non-zero. This has to be equal to 0, so it's quite easy to find coexistence in this linear setting. It's quite easy to find this coexistence state, which is alpha minus 1 times r, vector notation. And the first thing that emerges here is that coexistence requires alpha minus 1 r I to be positive for all I. Because you cannot, with this dynamics, you can never reach negative population size. If you start, assuming that you start with initial conditions that are physical with positive population sizes, then you're constrained to remain in the domain of positive population size. So that requires alpha minus 1 r I to be positive. And that is something that is known as feasibility. So I'm not even talking about is the equilibrium reached, is it stable, is it not? I'm just mentioning the fact that a coexistence equilibrium with those species is in principle possible. So that's the notion of feasibility. Furthermore, the fixed point is linearly stable if all the eigenvalues of the Jacobian are negative, with Ij is equal equal to minus ni star times it's the diagonal matrix of abundances times the interaction matrix. That's what gives you the Jacobian. So here I'm assuming that no one died. I'm going to that. And so just a slight remark. If you have symmetric interactions, which I mean is quite a restrictive assumption from an ecological point of view. It's symmetric. Then stability is equivalent to something that you can show that for this to have a negative real part of the spectrum, you need this to be positive definite. And the diagonal, I mean, the fact that you multiply by a diagonal matrix, because all those elements are positive, does not matter. So it's equivalent to spectrum of alpha being positive. That's only for symmetric matrices. And here I'm jumping ahead, but in practice, it generically work for things that we'll be considering later in the course. For high-dimensional systems with random interactions. So that's something that we will be considering later. Just mentioning it now. So you can forget about the symmetry requirements in that case.
So in that case, for when number of species is very large, typically the group of this means.
So yeah, I mean in the case that we'll be considering with random interactions, large number of species, but we will be considering cases where the interactions are weak in the number of species, so that you can have still a high-dimensional coexisting fixed points. Otherwise, you don't have that. Then we will find some stable fixed points, and essentially to assess stability, we can forget about that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you take the other limit, alpha ij totally, I think, which is never good because alpha ii by definition is zero. You don't want alpha I zero. So is there anything like that? So everybody hates everybody. Well, not everybody hates everybody. There is really distinction. Predator.
So I mean, if this guy is completely anti-symmetric, it's a bit of a weird regime because you can show that I don't want to say something wrong, but quite generically, I mean the dynamics exhibits a conserved quantity at least which you can write, and so it's I mean as soon as you have a few degrees of freedom, it's chaotic and you don't reach a steady state. So in general, I don't think this question really matters for anti-symmetric interactions.
It was famous paper by May, and he considered 3 species.
I'll discuss that.
But it was approach.
Yeah, that's something I'll discuss.
It was not
Yeah.
point. But I totally forgot what was it correct.
So 20 minutes, in 20 minutes from now.
Sorry, I don't understand. It generically works. What?
The fact that you can forget about, I mean, that you can just look at the spectrum of the interaction matrix to assess stability. instead of looking at the
In order
product.
that alpha j is symmetric or not?
So if alpha ij, so
No, if dimensional systems, then
so,
alpha j.
without the symmetry assumption, it's
No.
not symmetric. Okay. Now in practice, what can happen, as Pier Francesco was mentioning, is that if you initialize your system with a certain number of species that are present, they might not all be able to coexist, and some species might be driven to extinctions. So in practice, or let's say, however, some species might go extinct at long times. So now we assume that ni of t goes to ni star as t goes to infinity, with ni star in a subset, I'll call it I. So those are the surviving species. And ni star equals 0 for I not in this set, so those are extinct.
T to 0 is t to infinity.
And another zero.
Okay, so now we want to just introduce the same kind of discussion about the stability of these fixed points. So let me define R star and alpha star. The restriction of R alpha to elements of the ensemble of surviving species. So the same definition that I was introducing before extend. So the fixed point is feasible if alpha star minus 1 R star I is positive for all I. Then I mean, this assumption that those species are coexisting is consistent. So its stability, as before, requires that the spectrum of this guy, which is the Jacobian, is positive, where so for any vector, I mean, dj is the diagonal matrix of the elements j. So this is the same expression as before. So that stability condition does not change, right? But you also require that for all the extinct species, you have lambda I, which is Ri minus sum over j alpha ij is negative. And what's the meaning of this quantity is that as for if you linearize the generalized log-table dynamics that I was writing close to a degree of freedom that is extinct, you just get an exponential growth with this growth rate, and this is called the invasion growth rate. So if you introduce a system, a species at very, very small abundance into your system that is already constituted, can it invade or not? And this is the speed at which, I mean, the rate of exponential growth in the system. And so, if so lambda I is negative for all I, so what we say that the fixed point is an invariable.
But is it possible that the dynamics converge on a fixed point that is nevertheless invadable?
No, because it means nonlinear stability in the sense of dynamical system. So it won't converge there. Unless you're starting the system with initial conditions where some species are already absent. So if you start with n0 equal to 0, then you don't care whether n0 is invadable or not because the n0 is not there. But otherwise, no, you don't converge to the fixed point.
Principle of course you can some of this equal to 0, but you have to perform much more detailed analysis.
Exactly.
That's the generic case.
Yeah, that's the generic case. Now, I'd like to discuss something else, which is non-equilibrium coexistence, because in principle, your dynamical system can converge. I mean, depending on on this matrix alpha. So it can reach an attractor that is not a fixed point. So, I mean, very classical examples can be a cycle, you can have a chaotic attractor, all the things that we know from dynamics. So, in this model, a certain number of concepts that I've introduced for equilibrium coexistence translate to non-equilibrium coexistence under a specific condition. So I'll define n bar of t, which is the time average of the population. And zi of t, which is the log of the population sizes divided by t. So essentially, you can think that if n is decaying exponentially at long times, this will converge to the decay rate. Now, if you look at the GLT equation, and you look at the dynamics of the log, you integrate it. From the LV equation, that Zi of t at any time minus, okay, something that's the initial condition divided by t, it's not really important, is equal to Ri minus sum over j, alpha aj, n bar of t. So there is a relation between this quantity and the average of the population over time. And now I'm going to make an assumption which might sound like an innocuous assumption, but actually crucial. And which is the fact that in the long time average exists and is well defined. And okay, I'm not writing it explicitly, but I'm also assuming that the system is bounded from above, so that population, it might happen, so that population are confined, they don't explode. So if you assume this, from this equation, it's simple to get that this quantity also converges. And so at one time, you get this.
It's probably obvious if, for instance, you have finite cycle, this your Ni bar really converges if your first not explode.
Yes. So you're assuming that you're reaching a time translation variance steady state.
Yeah, it seems obvious, but for instance, maybe less obvious, maybe obvious, if you have quality. So is it possible to prove generically that it works on drafter of inside some limited regional space of each and I actually average really makes sense like that.
I would say so. But next, I mean, you were speaking about Maillard. Maillard is a case where this does not hold. And that's very specifically tied to the fact that you have this absorbing state at n equals 0. So that's not so obvious as an assumption, but it's so it makes sense. Okay, so where was I? Okay. So hence, I mean, this is the equation. And now if you have a species that survive, meaning that n star is positive, so necessarily Z star is equal to 0 based on this definition. I mean, Z star cannot be positive, otherwise it will explode. Cannot be negative, because otherwise it will be exponentially small in time. So for all the species that remain, this is this, and this is the same equation as the equilibrium condition that I was writing before. So this entails the feasibility condition. Now, if Zi star is negative, and I star is equal to 0, then you get that Ri minus sum over j, alpha ij and j star is negative. So this is an extinct species, right? And this is the inevitability condition. So some species might have gone extinct in your attractor, but the condition for the attractor to be maintained is that their time average growth rate now is negative. But it's the same set of equation as before, except that you don't have the requirement for the stability for the spectrum of this matrix. And all this was based on the assumption that time averages of population sizes converge. And so I will show you one case where that does not happen, and that's specific to those, or I mean, this class of models, even though you can find it in other models, but here it happens generically, it's not fine-tuned. And when I say this class of model, it's really the fact that you have these absorbing hyperplanes. If you set ni equal to 0, then you have ni dot is equal to 0. So another kind of dynamical behavior that you might have, which is a bit less conventional, is heteroclinic cycles. And so the first reference I know to this is May Leonard. So it's journal on applied math in 1975, and then there was a subsequent generalization by a series of authors. I don't remember all of them in the same journal. In 98. And so this is a striking consequence. So at the deterministic level of the presence of absorbing states at n equal to 0. And I would say that's a bit the deterministic tendence of what I was saying before about those broad distributions when you have a single population with noise. So here, what's happening is that, so in their case, which is a low dimensional case, which is the one I will discuss today, and probably a bit next time, is that the system exhibits non-periodic oscillations with ever increasing cycle time. And I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that. So the model that they have proposed is the following. So it's N1 dot, so it's a free species model. I'll assume that the alpha 1,1 is equal to alpha 2,2 is equal to alpha 3,3 in this setting. It's the same number, but okay, you can relax this assumption. And then you have alpha 1 and 2, slightly different notation from before, but I'll explain why. with so 0, alpha I, 1, beta I. So I'm selecting interaction coefficient that for I equals 1, 2, 3. So what does that mean? Is that it's a regime of mutual exclusion, which symbolically I want to picture like this. Here I have 1, 2, 3. I want to draw a cycle like this. So what does that mean? That means, and that's relatively easy to show, is that if n3 of 0 is equal to 0, so if I have only 1 and 2 initially, then n1 of t goes to 1, and n2 of t goes to 0. So if I have only 1 and 2, 1 beats 2. If I have only 1 and 3, 3 beats 1. And the cyclic thing, if I have only 3 and 2, 2 beats 3. That's the meaning of this regime. And so what that tells you is that so in the collection of fixed points, single species fixed points, so just 1, just 3, just 2, are invadable. Because if I have 1 and I put a bit of 3, then 3 is able to invade, and so that's not a linearly stable fixed point. So none of them is linearly stable. So there is a coexisting fixed point. It's unique with n1, n2, n3 larger than 0. Okay. And it's linearly stable. So it's a bit of a messy calculation. You have to look at the spectrum of this 3x3 matrix, but it's, I mean, I won't do it on the board, but it's straightforward. If, so the condition is this. With AI is equal to 1 minus alpha I, AI B is equal to beta I minus 1. It's linearly stable in that case. And in fact, when it's linearly stable, the system for any generic initial condition, provided that the initial condition are, I mean, all population sizes are positive, converges to this fixed point. What I'm interested in is what happens when this condition is not met. So there is no stable and invadable fixed point. So what happens? So when you run the dynamics on a computer, what you observe is the following. So this is your phase space. You have the 3 fixed points. So n1 equal 1, n2 0, n3 0, n3 1, n2 1, etc. You draw here the heteroclinic orbit. So I said going from 3 to 2. So I start with a tiny bit of 3, n1 equal to 0. I'm going to move to 2 following this orbit in the n1 equals 0 plane. You draw these 3 heteroclinic orbits. And what happens is that starting from some initial condition in the interior, the system is going to approach the boundary and cycle like this. But it's not doing it in a periodic fashion. If you plot, for instance, n1 of t as a function of time for a long time, you're going to see something like that. So this is one. And so it cycles, but the time it takes to complete the cycle is longer and longer. And the cycle time asymptotically grows linearly with the elapsed time. For any initial condition. That's the attraction factor.
This looks very artificial because as soon as there's some noise, then some species will go extinct.
Exactly, exactly. No, I completely agree with you. And we'll see that. Okay. So maybe I'll since it's noon, I'll leave for next time just showing why this arises. And I'll answer your question. So what that shows is that in a very simple setting, provided that I mean, here there is some sort of a strong ecological assumption, right? The cyclic dominance it's a bit weird, but it can be generic in the sense that it's robust to modal changes. It's not, you don't have to fine-tune parameters, that you have dynamics of interacting species model that converge to these weird attractors, which is indeed very fragile to extinction, meaning that as soon as you turn off a bit of noise, so what we'll see is that here, if the depth at which you go down is exponential in the elapsed time. So you approach arbitrarily 0. So as soon as you have a tiny bit of noise, very rapidly you're going to kill some species until you reach a single state with a single species, and then it will take an exponentially large time to go extinct. So that means that this dynamics of interacting species is prone to extinctions. It's very fragile to extinction. And that's something that we'll see is robust. I mean, is not even robust, is generic once you start having many species. Like this thing that requires some tweaking of the interaction matrix generically emerges in high dimension. But I agree with you, it's artificial in the sense that once you add any mechanism for extinction times, then you're going to go extinct in a time that is logarithmic in the scaling of that mechanism. So either 1 over the volume or that's fast. I think someone else was asking a question. Yes.
So you are stating now it's more. That kind of behavior is also rather typical of developing noise for high dimensional.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's something that we're going to see maybe probably not next week.
This guys, of course, this trajectory essentially spends almost all time near N1 or N2 and N3.
Yeah, so that's what you see. That's what you see here, that the resonancy time increases, but that the transition time, once you leave the vicinity of 0, is like order 1. Doesn't increase with the elapsed time.
The sum of the 3 curves is essentially 1. I mean, there is always one species that survives.
Yes. Except in those tiny bits where the 2 curves would cross, and there you might have a small deviation. I mean, you will have a deviation with respect to 1. but the time average of the population of the total population sizes converges to 1. And it's not even the time average, so it's just on very rare instances, it's not 1.
So how narrative do you describe? Okay, I understand. Interesting point. How we describe multidimensional, multi-species. It also will be one species typically, and all the rest are
No, it's multi-species equilibrium each time. But it's multi-species equilibrium, and you essentially move from one equilibrium to another, because none of these equilibrium are uninvadable. Okay, and so we'll stop here for today. Thank you for your. So